Let's learn in this Lightboard session how AKS backup works. AKS backup is typically used in order to create a backup from a first Kubernetes cluster and then restore that backup into a second cluster. And all of that will be managed and orchestrated by Azure Backup Vault and also by the Kubernetes backup extension. Because you are watching this video, then chances are high that you are looking for more content and more videos about Kubernetes, AKS, Terraform, and Azure. So I'll invite you to check out my YouTube videos to get more content. So let's see how this works. So let's start first with a first AKS cluster. So let's say this is my AKS cluster number 1, and this is my cluster. So it means that inside that cluster I have some objects deployed there, deployed into the nodes of that cluster. So into these nodes maybe I have some services deployed, I have some pods deployed, I have some deployment objects, I have some config maps, I have some secrets, I have some ingress, resources, and so on. And then in addition to these resources, so my pods, for example, if I have one or multiple pods, those pods actually will go to connect to persistent data. So let's say, for example, those pods will connect to an Azure Disk. So they will attach an Azure Disk in order to persist some data. This is useful for the persistent data. So here I would have an Azure Disk, okay? Here I'll be mentioning only the Azure Disk because as per today the AKS backup does support only the Azure Disk. For the Azure, for the other persistent volumes like the Blob and the file shares, they are not supported. And those resources actually they have their own tools to create backup for them. Okay, so let's talk here about the Azure Disk and those resources. Okay. So now if anything bad happens to this cluster, maybe I have a failure within an Azure region, or maybe I have lost that cluster because there are some human failures and so on, human errors, okay? Now I want to create a backup for this cluster, okay? So I want to perform a backup operation, and then so somewhere here I would have that all of those resources backed up, and then I want to restore that cluster into, or the resources from this cluster into another AKS cluster. So let's say we would have here another AKS cluster, that's AKS number 2, where again I would have my resources like the nodes, okay? And I want to restore back those resources. I want to restore everything from that first cluster, including the services, the pods, the deployment objects, the config map, the secrets, and the ingresses, okay? And all of these objects. In addition to these, I want to also be able to restore the Azure Disk, okay? So for that pod that is using an Azure Disk, I want also to be able to restore it. Okay, so this pod here should get access to the Azure Disk with that data. So from here, we will perform a backup into something that we'll discover later. And then from there, we want to be able to perform the restore operation. I want to restore everything from here into this cluster. So the tool that we'll be using is the AKS backup. AKS backup will use 2 Azure resources or 2 Azure services. First of all is the storage account. So we need to have a storage account, and we'll see in a moment why we need that storage account. So within that storage account, actually we need to have a Blob container. And within this Blob container, we'll go to save those Kubernetes objects, okay? I mean those deployments, pods, config maps, secrets, and so on. We'll go to also save the logs from my clusters. The logs also, actually, they will be saved right here. Great, so that's for those YAML or for those Kubernetes manifest files. But Sometimes we see that those files are already in our Git repository, so we can apply them directly here. Yes, that could be. But here, typically, this operation of backup and especially the restore is more fast than reapplying the all of these resources from the Git repository, because this is like restoring a snapshot of all of these resources at once. Okay. And during the event of disaster recovery, you want to be fast when you restore your resources into the new infrastructure. So that's for those YAML manifest files, okay? Now for the Azure Disk, we will not put the Azure Disk into a storage account, but we'll use another solution actually. So for the restore or for the backup of those Azure Disk, we'll go to use another tool. We'll go to leverage here another tool available in Azure, that is the Azure Disk Snapshot. So how this works? So within AKS already today we have support for the CSI snapshot, okay, for the disk snapshot. That's a feature that you can enable in your cluster, okay. So make sure you enable that, the disk snapshot, okay. We should enable that actually in addition to the CSI driver for the disk. This Azure Disk is actually a disk of type CSI. Okay, so this will perform the disk snapshot operation in order to create the backup. Okay, and then when we restore into the second cluster, actually this disk, which is the from this backup, it will be restored from this disk snapshot. So from here we would have this operation that will go like this for the restore. So we use the storage account to restore the Kubernetes objects, and then we use the disk snapshot from Azure in order to restore the Azure Disk. So this is the whole architecture. Now the one that will go to orchestrate all of these operations is the AKS backup or the Azure Backup Vault. Let's add it into our dashboard. So it's Azure Backup Vault. It's not ASR, okay? It's not Azure Site Recovery. It's Azure Backup Vault. We will go to orchestrate all of this work. So first, what we need to perform in AKS in order to be able to perform or to trigger this backup is to install the AKS backup extension. So this means until here inside my AKS cluster, I need the backup extension. That backup extension will install some pods actually, and behind the scenes it's using Velero plugin for Azure, okay? It's not the entire Velero open source project, it's the Velero plugin for Azure, which supports those type of operations like creating the snapshot from an Azure disk or restoring or backing up the disk, the Kubernetes files, okay? So we need to have this extension installed in the first cluster, and we need it also to be installed into the second cluster so that we can perform the restore operation. So, and that's the first thing to do after creating the cluster. Let's add that into here. Backup extension. Now this backup extension actually, it will use a managed identity in order to authenticate into the storage account. Okay, so it will perform actually some airbag roles for the storage account, because it will connect to the storage account in order to upload those Kubernetes manifests into the Blob container. And the same for the second one right here. Again, it will use a managed identity with access through airbag roles into the storage account. Now the Azure Backup Vault is the orchestrator for all of this these processes. So Azure Backup Vault will communicate with the backup extension. So it will connect to the backup extension to instruct it in order to create a backup, create the backup or start the backup, and it will instruct the second extension here in order to start the or to perform the restore operation. This Azure Backup Vault have its own configuration also, so it will use actually a policy that will define the frequency or the date, the time trigger when to trigger those backups. It will also define an instance that will define what is the AKS cluster that we want to backup. I hope this was helpful. Thank you.